Thank you, folks. What I want to talk about today, and not for too long, is something that I think a lot of us might process as a problem in using our own language in these United States. And that is that we're accustomed to thinking of talking and even speaking as something that we do with relatively little effort. And yet, these days, often it seems that we're constantly being asked to change our linguistic habits. It seems that the linguistic terrain is constantly shifting beneath us, and we can't do what we want to do even if we think of ourselves as fairly enlightened and moral people. And I want to explain why I think we need to get used to this linguistic insecurity that I think all of us are suffering these days, and open up to the fact that part of being a concerned and conscious speaker of American English in our times is to be used to constant change and constant demands that we revise what we thought before. But I think that if we look at these things through a certain lens, we can learn to actually like it. We can learn to like ourselves even a little better. And I'm going to refer to three things that I think get up a lot of our noses lately that are perhaps less irritating than they might seem if we just pull the camera back. So, for example, they. The way we use supposedly third-person plural pronoun they. There's the way you learned about it in school. There's the way that you intuitively think of it. And then there's the way that it's actually been used for a very long time. And there's the way that it's been being used only for a very short time, which can seem, I openly admit myself, as a linguist and as somebody who is very much open to language change, it can seem almost frustrating. So, what do I mean by the challenges of they? Well, first of all, we say that they is a third-person plural pronoun, but then there's a way that it's often used where suddenly they is used in the singular. And so, tell each student that they can hand in their paper a day late if they want to. Now, many people find a sentence like that deeply offensive. The idea is that, well, they is plural. And we kind of feel that that's written on high somehow. They is plural. And so you can't use it to refer to one person because they is plural. Now, the truth is that most people, especially if they're not monitoring themselves, use they in the singular all the time because it's been part of English, and not just on this side of the ocean, for many, many, many centuries. And so it's always so easy to think that something you just noticed started recently. I am not immune from that. Almost inevitably, it's much older than you think. And that singular usage of they, the first rock-solid example of that is the 1400s. It goes back that far. If you've ever enjoyed Vanity Fair, if you've actually read through the whole thing, Thackeray does it all the time. A person can't help their birth. And we think of Thackeray as writing in this high, beautiful, British, antique-y kind of English. He did it. And so it's happening now. And it's there, and many non-prescriptivists, such as I am, as a linguist type, have been saying for a very long time that we need to just let that go. And I sense that over the past about 10 years, there's been a crack in the dam on that. For somebody to say, tell each student that they can hand in their paper. There are going to be some people who don't like it, but more and more, many of us are realizing that we have bigger fish to fry in terms of that which is a threat to the civic order. But there's more with they, especially lately. It's one thing to say, tell each student that they can hand in their paper late. Because even if you, quote unquote, don't like it, you can make a certain sense out of it. There's a reason that people use they in that way, because you're thinking of various students. You may be referring technically to one, but you're imagining male and female students walking up and down that corridor. And so there's a natural sense that you might drift into referring to the body of those individuals as they. That's how language always works. There are always these implications that affect how you use language that are different from what the strict meat and potatoes reference might be. But nowadays, with younger people, we're being asked to refer to individuals as they directly where only the singular is meant. And what I mean by that is that I have, for example, a cousin who has decided that she wants to be referred to as they because of our evolving conceptions of gender. And so instead of saying she's been sick lately, we would say they have been sick lately, not referring to assorted, possibly sick people that might be men and might be women, but just her. And especially if you teach at a college or a university, you're probably familiar with this being a request that individual students now make, that you refer to them, and I'm using it now in the old-fashioned way, as in there are various people like this who we may have thought of as men or women, refer to them as they directly when you're talking about that one person to some other one person. Now, that's different, and that takes effort. To say, tell each student that they can hand in their paper late doesn't take effort because, frankly, most of us say it because it's part of modern American English grammar. It's just not in the books. But to say something along the lines of, oh, yes, I met them yesterday and they were a lot of fun. That's hard if you've spent a whole life not using they that way. And there have been those, and Jordan Peterson is by no means the only one, who have said, no, I am not going to do that. That's too much. And there are people who have a sense that that's a kind of willful pushing upon our sense of what you might call tolerance, that that's taking the language and bending it to extremely individual and idiosyncratic and perhaps even willful goals. That's an understandable view. It might not always be expressed politely, but for a person to feel that way does not make them an immoral person. But I think that there's a different way that we can look at the effort that it does take to use they in that way, because it does take an effort. I have confronted it, and notice I use that verb because it's hard and you feel on the spot. I've confronted it twice during this calendar year, and one time just kept on using the person's full name because I knew I was going to mess it up, and luckily it was a short telephone call. And then about a month ago, having to really do it, with the person sitting right there and just screwed it up about 18 times, and luckily they were tolerant. You know, it's tough. I'm 52, I didn't grow up with this. But, you know, we're capable of the effort. And you know how we know it? Because all of us have made and constantly make the same effort in using a sentence like Billy and I went to the store. Yeah, now I know all of you are thinking, but that's the way it's supposed to be. Well, that's what somebody said sometime in the early 19th century, and it happened to really get around. But there is no child who grows up speaking English, who grows up naturally saying, Billy and I went to the store. Any kid says Billy and me and has to be told. For that one construction, somehow everything else kind of comes, but with that one thing, they say Billy and me, and they have to be told, no, you say Billy and I. You've got it wrong. Why? It's because that rule is nonsense. And I have noticed that it makes people angry when I push this, and I'm not trying to make you angry, but this is not linguist to let it all hang out ideology. It's just pure common sense. So, well, I is the subject and me is the object, you say, because somebody liked that Latin worked that way back in about 1835. But that's just not how English works. And here's how you know. Who broke the lamp? Me. Now, who would say, who broke the lamp? I. You know, if anybody tells you to say it that way, you didn't listen. So, but the thing is, you're talking about I broke the lamp. Now, no, you wouldn't say me broke the lamp. And some people's response to that is to say, well, the me is short for it was me. But why are you shortening it? How long is it to say it was me? Why are you making it shorter? What you mean is me broke the lamp, except if you don't say the broke the lamp part, you just say me, because in that case, you use me as the subject. Who broke the lamp? They. That's a Martian. That's something that a computer would generate. Who broke the lamp? Them. Now, if you still insist on the idea that it's because it's short for it was them, let's try this sentence. You got Billy and I went to the store. I and Billy went to the store. Well, I is the subject, isn't it? But you would never say I and Billy went to the store. It sounds like somebody from another planet. And that's because there is a rule in English. There's a rule about I and me. It doesn't happen to be about subject and object. Really, there is this form, I, if we're talking about the first person singular, that's used when a verb happens to be coming afterward. That's a slight oversimplification, but that'll do for here. Everywhere else, the first person singular pronoun in English is me, regardless of case. And I'm not making that up. That's how we talk. Who broke the lamp? Me. Me and Billy went to the store. Never I and Billy went to the store. If a little kid said I and Billy went to the store, imagine how you'd feel like a house divided against itself because you want to correct it, but I is the subject. You've been hoaxed, folks, about Billy and I went to the store. But we've all learned it. I know not to say Billy and me went to the store in a setting like this, or at a cocktail party, whatever that is. I know not to say those things because I've been taught. But I'll openly admit that after a glass or two of water, I would much rather say Billy and me because that's what English is. I have already told my 6-year-old that Billy and I is something you're going to have to learn because unreasonably it's expected of you, just like having to wear a lot of clothing, but that Billy and me is okay. So, my point being, we have all learned Billy and I went to the store, despite the fact that it's unnatural, that it always feels like a little bit of a thickening of tongue. You can get so good at it that you don't think about it. But we had to learn that, and it's not natural, and we slip all the time. The whole business of between you and I, the fact that most people don't ever internalize what this supposed rule is. So, if we can do Billy and I went to the store, certainly we can master they are sick and so they won't be coming to Thanksgiving, referring to one person. It's weird, but honestly, Billy and I went to the store, in the grand scheme of things, is weirder. And yet, we've all mastered it. So, they is one of those things that can seem scary, but I think that if we have learned that I must be a subject pronoun most of the time, which from a linguistic perspective is like saying that green is red in terms of how English works, we can use they differently. I think that we're up to it. We can pat ourselves on the back for having learned Billy and I, and now they, Renee, are not coming to Thanksgiving. We can get it. So that's one thing that I hope that we can work on. Second thing, the euphemism treadmill, as Steven Pinker has artfully titled it, is going to start going faster, and I think we need to get used to it. So, for example, 1935, you could have an institution called Home for Cripples. That was perfectly ordinary. That was considered a respectful name for the people in question. That changed because there are, unfortunately, negative associations with people who suffer from that particular affliction. And if you're trying to euphemize, the fact is that those negative associations are inevitably going to settle back down upon the term, like you wave away gnats, but then they're going to settle back down, or you can think of rust as the analogy. That can't not happen. And so, crippled yielded to handicapped. That is now an antique term because all of the negativity settled upon it. That was replaced by disabled. Disabled now is tottering, and there are various things that we're learning to say otherwise, such as differently abled. That's the euphemism treadmill, and it can feel as if there's something willful about it. Why can't people settle on one thing that they want to be called? But really, it's a natural process in society where you try to use words in a way that might help to change thought, that might push the conversation along. But that kind of thing only happens slowly. Thought changes more slowly than vocabulary can. And so you have to just keep pushing it along. In the 1930s, the idea of giving poor families checks to help them get through a difficult period was anathema to many, many people on all sides of the political spectrum. And so what we now know as, for example, welfare was first artfully titled Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Aid, notice that, what kind of aid? That was a euphemism. The idea was to keep people from thinking about what was often thought of as just the dole in pitilessly negative terms. That got old. The next term was home relief. That one is one that only people of a certain age, I get the feeling now, would remember being in active use. I think I just missed it. But home relief, again, is a euphemism. Welfare. Think about what that word actually means. If I say welfare now, the first thing we think of is that policy. But really, more abstractly, welfare is a very warm word referring to how well people are faring. To use that word for the policy that we're talking about was a very deft and artful euphemism. However, the gnats settled down upon it, and now more and more we're hearing about cash assistance. What kind of assistance? Again, it's a euphemism, the idea being to push along conceptions of what welfare is for and its importance in a society. So that's the euphemism treadmill. What's really interesting is when you're undergoing the kind of change that I'm talking about, when history is actually happening. So for example, this is something that's just happening at this point. Sexual harassment is a term that technically goes back to the 70s. It became mainstream, really, in 1990 and 1991. The Thomas Hill trial seems to have institutionalized it. Sexual harassment. It's been a while. As you would expect, that term is getting a little old. It's getting a little beat up. There are, unfortunately, many people who feel that calls of sexual harassment are excessive, the whole notion offends them. Those people will always be with us. Those are the gnats. And so they have descended upon the term sexual harassment such that, notice, and this hasn't been officially noticed yet to my knowledge, but notice that we're now saying sexual misconduct. Sexual harassment is what we would have said 10 years ago. Now it's sexual misconduct. What's the difference? It's just that to say sexual misconduct is fresher. It's something that allows an easier and more productive conversation than sexual harassment, where we think to ourselves that there's a certain group in the corner who are going to object that there's no such thing as sexual harassment or that we're exaggerating. Me Too is serving that function as well. Me Too has become a noun. I heard the comedian Michelle Wolf the other night referring to a certain individual as the biggest Me Too in America. And I thought, I didn't know it was a noun, but I guess it is. You can be Me Too'd, etc. And just think, that term didn't exist in common parlance last Thanksgiving when I was learning about singular they. And so, we're having a new usage because sexual harassment, as you could have predicted in 1991, especially by the 2000 teens, would have started to rust. And I'm not saying that that's the best thing, but that's something that generally happens. Now, how that relates to us today is that that's going to start happening faster. And I hope that we can see it as not some mysterious cabal of people changing the terms on us to frustrate us, but really it's just because of modern social media, we are today more of a village than we've really been since a very, very, very long time ago. And so, for example, politically correct. I remember in 1984 having a roommate. Imagine the general air about him was that of the Cat in the Hat. If the Cat in the Hat was human, imagine that's my roommate. Take the hat off, and that's him. And he was very politically aware. And at one point, he mentioned that he liked a certain person because this person was politically correct, and he had his eyebrow kind of arched the way the Cat in the Hat does. Politically correct. I had never heard that term. And everybody kind of giggled. And what he meant was that this person had a certain conglomeration of left liberal beliefs, which he was saying in shorthand are the ones that we all know are the proper ones, and we're not going to have an argument about it. But we know what one another mean. The views of roughly Bella Abzug. Even that was dated at the time, but you know what I mean. So the idea was you were politically correct. It wasn't a slur yet. There were Republicans on campus. They weren't using that term. Politically correct was a warm, wise term. Now, I remember when I was a graduate student, about 10 years later, that it had been transmogrified. First, it had been shortened to PC, and there were people who had taken it and started using it as a term of abuse, the idea being that to call yourself politically correct is to attempt to shut down conversations, etc. We're all familiar with the contours of that debate. Now, it got to the point after about 20 years that people started saying, well, I'm not PC, but, and then would express the same kinds of political views that my cat in the hat roommate talked about. You started stepping away from what political correctness supposedly was because the term had become a slur. You knew that that meant that it needed replacement, that something else was going to come in. That replacement has been the term woke. Woke actually has the same meaning as politically correct did in the 80s. Not in the 90s and the aughts, but back in the 80s when it had this brief shining day of being a compliment. Woke has the same meaning, including that arched eyebrow, the idea being that we know there are other ways of looking at things, but let's face it, those things can't be bothered. We can't be bothered with those things right now because we've got other things to talk about. So we know what woke is. Now, if it were the old days, woke would have lasted at least 15 years. I first heard of woke in early 2016. I always have my face in a book. I have small children. I'm not a very vernacular person, and so I tend to basically miss these things until they're already cresting. So I'm going to say that woke for real people was a term that was being used productively in 2000, let's say 2014. The term technically goes back to the 50s, where it was a kind of an affectionate black in-group slang. But nobody outside of that group had heard of it until relatively recently. So in the mid-2000 teens, it takes off. Notice that woke now is spent. Woke is already being used in quotation marks. People are already stepping away from it. It's become a quiet little joke among a great many people. Not the views themselves, but that particular label for it. And the reason that woke is already being used in quotation marks, where you kind of giggle if you talk about somebody considering themselves to be woke, is because we can talk about things and talk to one another so much more and so much faster now than we used to. So, social media, particularly social media since the crucial year, this is something that I think needs to become more of a meme in society, 2009. 2009 is when Twitter and Facebook really took off. And that was a really seismic year in terms of basically turning our whole American consciousness upside down. People say, for example, that the Tea Party arose because of racism. Yeah, partly, but it also arose because in 2009, you had this new kind of media. Everything changes that year. Not 2008, it was already gone by 2010. It was 2009, and I remember, because I was there and already an aging grown-up. It was 2009. So, because of 2009 and the fact that we're talking to one another instead of just listening to Walter Cronkite talk to us all day long, every day, it means that terms are going to get worn out faster. We're going to see these changes happening quickly all of the time. There were analogs in the past. It used to be, for example, that if you presented something on radio or television, it got worn out much faster than we're used to. If it was a matter of entertainment, where you had the whole Ed Sullivan audience watching, then things went by very quickly. I think of a very obscure example. It's not the one I was going to use, but this is what I'm thinking of, so I'm just going to use it. 1934, there was a comedian on the radio named Joe Penner. He had 3 jokes. One of them was that he would say, "Wanna buy a duck?" and laugh. That was considered the funniest thing in the world in the fall of 1934. You can listen to it. It's not funny. But everybody thought that was just hilarious. He had that and 2 other lines. By spring of 1935, America was sick of that joke, and his career never came back, and not long after that, he just rolled over and died because his career was finished, and he was in a hotel room, and he was tired. That took care of Joe Penner. Now, that happened so quickly because of the radio. He would get on the radio every week and say, "Wanna buy a duck?" and the laughs just, get quieter and quieter. You can hear it through the shows. That now is our lives. Basically, all of our communication is as if all of us were listening to a particular radio show or even producing our own, such as a podcast, every week. And so the euphemism treadmill is going to go faster and faster and faster. And I think we should get used to it, instead of being frustrated in particular that the names of things, that terminology for things is going to keep on shifting beneath our feet. It's going to happen faster and faster because we all now are as if we lived in one village, sitting in front of our little domiciles, talking to one another all the time. That's how Homo sapiens emerged. 300 people talking to each other all the time with no writing. It's almost alarming how close to that we have come back to, including the lack of writing. We talk at one another all day long, except the village is bigger. So that is the euphemism treadmill and how it's going to keep going faster. Third thing, final thing, is profanity. I think that you talk about being prescriptive and telling people that Billy and I went to the store is wrong and telling people how they should talk. Well, now I'm going to be prescriptive, and I don't know how useful this is going to be, but I think that it's one of those things that just needs to be said. We need to reform our view of what profanity is. We are dragging, rattling tin cans behind us about what constitutes bad words that I think is not productive. And as I raise children, I'm finding I can't even pretend the old validity of. I've already appalled some other parents by allowing certain things from my kids because I'm just thinking by the time they're 12, they're going to be using these words all the time. Why am I telling my daughter that and I am going to have to use these words, please understand I'm doing it only for clarity. Why should I tell my daughter that the word is poop and that shit is a word that makes her a bad, bad girl? I don't get it. I've told her not to say it in her classroom, but I've told her you can use it around me because she's 6. In 6 years, as soon as my back is turned, she's going to be using it all the time. Why protect her? That is very 2018, of course. I don't think I would have felt that way in, say, 1995. But our sense of profanity as these words, and I'll try not to use them too much after this, but damn, hell, shit, fuck. The idea that those 4 words are profane is tragically obsolete, and I've never felt it more than when I had to explain it to little people who don't understand. And the reason is because there was a time when it was a big deal when Clark Gable said, I don't even need to fill it in. You know, that was a long time ago now. During that time, one that isn't so well known is that Maxwell Perkins, who's editing at Scribner's, has a manuscript of Hemingway's. Hemingway used the word fuck a few times. Perkins literally couldn't use the word in the office. He could only write it down. He wasn't a strange man. He was a very nice man. He was wearing his fedora, drinking with people, but you just didn't use the word. My parents were quite profane people. I remember shit being used all the time. Not the F word as much, but things have changed. I use the F word constantly. And I am generally known as, the kind of person you wouldn't want to have a beer with, etc. I use the F word all the time. In Denver, just yesterday, plane to Aspen was late. I used that word a lot. And it wasn't, to create an effect. It was because jeepers was not how I felt. That is the time that we live in. One of my students, very proper kind of person, gave me, I don't know why, but she gave me a T-shirt. Oh, right, I'd written her a recommendation or something. She gave me a T-shirt. It's made out of some sort of soft material. It must be from like Mars or something. I love wearing this T-shirt. It's this charcoal color, and it says on it, OMG, WTF. I don't know why. I don't know what that's advertising, but that's what it says. And I wear it around the house all the time when it's warm. And actually, my 6-year-old asked me the other day, what's that? And she just learned to truly read. Thank God she can curl up with a book. Oh, I've been waiting for this. But she asked me, what's with a f? And I just told her, windows are open, we had company. And I just said, it's oh my God and what the fuck. And be very careful about saying those things when you're not with me or your mother. Now, profanity starts in the Stone Age of Game of Thrones as being about oaths. You weren't supposed to swear to God. Hence the idea that some people still follow today, that you don't take the Lord's name in vain. Therefore, you say egad instead of oh my God. You say zounds, which starts out as his wounds. You can imagine whose wounds were meant. That's what profanity was in a society where heartfelt and unquestioned religion was central. It made sense. Things changed, as they always do. Next, in a society where you're not supposed to refer to breasts or limbs with poultry, because you might think of those things on a woman, and so you start saying dark meat and white meat, and it's not that dark. That's how that started. That starts again in this accursed early 19th century. These bourgeois norms, which were very uptight about sex and excretion, are why you refer to a restroom. Are you really resting in there? Not really. That was because you weren't supposed to even begin to refer, not even to water, because you start thinking about what the water is for. You're just in there to relax. And hence, you're not supposed to talk about sex and excretion. And so the word cunt in medieval texts just means the female part. There's nothing obscene about it. You can see it referred to along with ureters and the bladder and everything else. It was the term vagina was a Latinism that was brought in particular to help euphemize what used to just be referred to the way you'd refer to an arm. So there's the time when it's about religion, and in that society that made sense. It was coherent. There was a time when to curse was about sex and excretion. That made sense in a society that was, to us, almost barbarically uptight about those things. However, we're not that society today. Yes, there are religious people, but there are just as many who aren't. We are no longer a society where there's no such thing as professing atheism in public, or if you do, it's considered utterly bizarre. On sex and excretion, if anything, since the 1960s, we almost pride ourselves on not being uptight about things like that. And that's just the way it's been, and it's going to stay that way. However, what that means is that, as you would expect, what is profanity in our society is something quite different. Profanity is not shit. That's not profane. No anthropologist would recognize our constant use of that word, or at least most of us' constant use of that word, as profane. The anthropologists, like say the anthropologist from the planet Jupiter, would recognize those quote-unquote four-letter words, that's salty. You can use them to have a certain effect. You hit your thumb with a hammer, and one of those words is going to come out. Just salty, but not profane. Here's profane. Nigger, faggot, cunt. Notice, you should have heard the silence I just heard. Those are the words that you don't use. Those are the kinds of words that today create an effect that, frankly, damn, hell, fucking shit used to not so very long ago. Those are profane words. Those are the words that I would never allow my children to use at all. If I found out that they did, I would be as horrified as Rob and Laura Petrie are on an episode of The Dick Van Dyke Show, where little Richie in school has used a word which, of course, according to the mores of the time, they can't specify, but it's obvious that he used the word fuck. And they're as horrified as if today he called somebody well, that was then. We've changed. What's profane to us is slurring groups. That to us is something that we are justifiably uptight about, that we find horrific, that we don't want our children to do, that we don't want us to do, that we think of as connected to the very morality of a human being. And therefore, these are the words which I think quite justifiably are euphemized in the media. These words, although there can be excesses, these are the words where there is distinct and often accurate sanction for people using them in public places. We want those words to go away, and I consider that to be a moral advance over being uptight about excretion, or frankly, if I may, and this is just me, I don't mean any disrespect, about God. I think of it as an advance to be that uptight about slurs against groups. But what that means is that I think as mature users of the language, of course, there are lines to be drawn and opinions will differ. But I think the media's shyness at this point of publishing a word such as, when Donald Trump refers to certain countries as shitholes, for any media outlet to be afraid to use that word because it's profane, come on, stop. You want to actually be accurate about what the president said. You don't want anybody to have to guess. And if anything, because that was such a terrible thing, you want the full effect of what he said to be there in cold, hard print all the time, and said to the extent that people read less and listen to podcasts more. It should be sayable. It should not be bleeped, because most of us use the word shit all the time. It isn't just Donald Trump. In that, he was being a normal person of his time. Most presidents wouldn't use it in that particular setting, but still, many of us, I have certainly used that word in faculty meetings and nobody even jumped. It's just normal. Now, when it comes to the other words that I mentioned, where they are so nasty that I'm not going to say them again, yes, we do need to be euphemistic. And so Samantha Bee recently called Ivanka Trump a feckless. Now, you probably know what word she used. It began with a C. It ended with a T. Now, that is not something that you want the New York Times to have on the top of the page. You understand why, for example, Slate or Salon might not put the word. I wouldn't want my children to come see me reading that and to ask me what that word is. I can't be flippant about that word. That's because those words are profane. I think I am already telling my children, and I want them to spread it, profanity is those words. Those words are profane. Why can't I use them? Because they're evil, and here's why they're evil. Shit, hell, damn, and fuck are salty, and I think that we're pretending a certain antique sensibility to completely protect our children from them until they're 12. Think about modern pop music at this point and what they're going to hear. That music isn't going away, and a lot of it is very good music. But that means that to protect them from those words at this point simply doesn't have the coherence that it did in 1975 or even 1985. Our profanity is against slurs, and we should think of it that way, and therefore not wonder why there are certain words that you're just not allowed to say. Many people will say, well, there are these words that you just can't say, and I want to say them. I think we should be able to explain the reason you can't say those words is because we do not slur against groups. It's part of being an advanced Homo sapiens to understand that we work against our tribalist tendencies as much as possible, even though they will always be there. So that's just my 2 cents, maybe that was 3, about what we should think of as bad words. But in sum, the language is shifting beneath our feet. It never hasn't been, but it's happening more quickly now than it used to. And I think we can learn to almost enjoy it if we understand that, of course, the language is going to change as we advance our conceptions of how sex and gender work. Of course, the language is going to change faster since we have the world in our pockets. There's so many advantages to having the world in your pocket. You can listen to Joe Penner when you leave this room because he's in your pocket. That's an advantage. But it also means that there are going to be changes in what we call things that are going to go faster than most of us ever thought could be possible. And then also, in terms of what we can't say, what might seem unjustifiably, as you might call it, PC, or at least as some of us would have called it, is because we're learning that you do not slur groups of people. You work against, even if you can't completely eliminate, tribalism. That's what profanity is. You can explain to somebody quite clearly why that is profane, rather than having to stutter and say, well, just because, and your great-grandmother wouldn't like it. That's not good enough. So, the language is going to keep changing. I don't like change. I like things to stay exactly the way they are. I don't even like buying new clothes. I like things to just stay. But you know, with language, they just don't. And I think that we can learn to enjoy the change if we have a little bit more of a sense of why these things are happening. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I have time for questions. Pam?
So, can you just describe what's the difference between the euphemism treadmill and concept creep?
Concept creep is different. And that is because you can apply, that's a very good question, you can apply a label to something, and gradually it gets to the point where it's not that negative associations have settled down upon the word, but rather we're using the word to refer to different things than started. And so, for example, one that I would use is that it can be very confusing what racism means today. You know, the word actually goes back to, racism is in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1924. And when you look at what it meant then, it meant roughly to cast aspersions upon or to have negative feelings about a group of people who are characterizable via a racial connotation. That was what it meant. Today we can use it to mean that, but what racism is otherwise can be very confusing. And so you can say something where various people who are Black Americans might not agree. And they might not agree for perfectly good reasons. Some people would say, therefore, what you said was racist. That's a stretch from what the word originally meant. And some people find it confusing to understand what the word means. I think that that is correct. It's become quite the protean word. There's a mission creep that has happened with that particular word. That can happen all the time. So that's not about negative associations. That's that always there are resonances beyond the original meaning that a word has. And so, for example, in Shakespeare, one of the reasons that Shakespeare, we don't like to admit it, but Shakespeare live is hard, is because when somebody says generous in Shakespeare, they mean noble. They don't mean that the person hands out their goods. They mean that the person wears breeches. So somebody says generous, and you think, oh, and then you can tell they don't mean magnanimous, and the person keeps going. Well, if you're a noble person, then part of being a noble person, especially in the society that Shakespeare was at least just coming out of, was that you gave things out. Next thing you know, generous starts to mean giving things out. That's how language change happens. That's why you have the kind of creep that you're talking about. That's a different challenge because it happens so slowly. I don't think any of us can remember when racism only meant what it means in the dictionary. Part of being a sophisticated person is to understand what more it means. But it's a hazy cloud. So yes, that can be frustrating and one works on it. In the back, I can't see you except that you have glasses.
I do. I can't stand
there you go, okay.
Professor McWhorter, I'm just curious about how the euphemism around describing what we would call today African Americans, which in my lifetime has really varied over time, and I think it's confusing. And I just wonder if you could address Black versus African American versus Negro and the history of that, and what is politically correct and appropriate.
Yeah, that's a tough one. What you call Black people naturally, for reasons I probably don't need to spell out, has a way of attracting the gnats that we're talking about. To the extent that there are negative conceptions of Black people, whatever the name is of the moment is going to wear out for that reason. And so there was a time when Negro was perfectly fine. I'm going to grab 1920 arbitrarily. And that sticks in the names of various organizations I don't need to name. Now, as time went by, Negro and colored became accreted in that way. And so, especially in the late 60s, although the rumblings were before that, Black became the preferred term. And the idea was that Black was a proud term, that it had nothing to do with darkness or wrong. I grew up with Black. Then, in the late 80s, particularly at the behest of Jesse Jackson, the new term became African American, the idea being that Black maybe needed a refresher, that there were negative associations with Black. African American was seen to to connote a certain kind of pride in pointing back to the African heritage in the same way as an Italian American might. And now, here we are. So 1980, when did I learn African American? 80, I would have been late. I remember picking it up in 89. So let's say that, 87 is when the edict came down. And so now here we are, it's 30 years after that. As you would expect, African American is getting tired. And part of the reason is because since the late 80s, a great many people from Africa have come to the country. There are a great many people who are African American in the sense that the people in The Godfather are Italian American. And it gets a little obscure. If you're from Ghana and you speak Twi and you're here in America, you're African American, are you really the same thing as a black guy from Cleveland? It just gets confusing. And then you have very white people from South Africa who come here and genuinely don't understand why they can't be called African American. And then there's some of us, and I openly admit I'm one of them. I have never taken on African American. I mean, people have bigger fish to fry, but in print and in the media, unless I absolutely have to, I just use black. For me, that was good enough for me. I like the idea that it reclaimed all the negative associations with blackness. And as far as African, I have huge respect for Africans. I know many Africans. I am not African in any sense that has any meaning. It's been too long. It never felt right to me. I always thought I stake my ground here as a black American person, no African. So I never used it. In that, I am, shall we say, a minority. But I hear, I hear that it's fraying among the kids, and that black is coming back. I keep being told that by people about half my age. I don't spend much time with them, so I don't know. But frankly, this is prescriptive. I hope so, because I never liked African American. But maybe if it's not going to be black, it'll be something else. I'd love to know what it was going to be, and I'm still going to stick with black. But that's why. Racism is why the terms keep changing. And so, and I sincerely mean this, you have to expect it. Until there's no racism, yes, every term for black people is going to get gunked up and be replaced by something else. Nature of the beast. Sir, silver hair, yes. From here, you do.
My name's Fred Dust. I'm from IDEO, and thanks. I really appreciate it. And you actually alluded to the question I have, which is, are we fooling ourselves? I'm a gay man. When we think about the notion of reclaiming things that actually might be profane. So, right, the notion that we can say queer now is because we, as a collective, said we want to own that. And so when you talk about some of the things that are profanities now, some of the words you mentioned before, can you imagine a world where we reclaim those things, or is that just fooling ourselves? I'm curious.
How quirky do I wish to be? Either way, I'm all for that reclaiming, but I sense that I'm strange. The N-word has been reclaimed in that way, and so the way that black people use it among themselves means buddy. That's what it means. And nothing is odder to me than watching people from the outside say, well, if they can say it, why can't we? Because it's two different words. Buddy is one thing, lower organism is another. But it was reclaimed. But, and what I mean by quirky, and many people would consider me repulsive in saying this, is given that it has been reclaimed in that way, anybody who aims it at me, I figure it's obsolete, and if you feel that way, you're lower than me. It leaves me unmoved, and that's how I felt even before I knew that I wasn't supposed to say it. I remember a drunken, lowly, white man. I lived in an apartment complex, and he kept hanging out outside of it. And one night I said, will you be quiet? Because he was loud and drunk. And that word came out. As soon as I turned my back, I thought I can feel it coming because it's all he's got. And, I walked into the door and I thought I win. And just because he called me that word that makes him lower. And years later, I realized, oh, wow, that was supposed to be my big moment. I was supposed to walk into my apartment and start crying because he called me this word that, traces back. I don't feel it. And many people would say that it's because I'm trying to make a point. Many people would say that it's because I'm arrogant. And really, that's not it. It's just that I have too much to do. I can't be bothered. However, I'm not representative in that. Most black people would say that when that word comes at them, they feel hurt. And so it means that there are these two words. So in that sense, the reclaiming hasn't worked because the word still has its sting, and I have to respect how people feel that way. I don't. I kind of feel that we got rid of it. In the same way, if I may use the word faggot and queer, same thing. If it hurts, one way to get rid of the hurt. And for me, I want to get rid of the hurt. I'm not interested in saying somebody hurt me and put me in a lower position. It makes me feel like I'm in a lower position, and I don't like it. The idea is, how can I make it so that they won't hurt me? Same thing. So I've always seen gay men doing that. I genuinely don't know what the feeling is about people using the word as a slur. I imagine it's the same thing as what I'm talking about. In my world, if I could have it my way, one, shit would not be profane, and two, anybody who, I'm going to use the word, anybody who called me a nigger would immediately feel like, whoops, because the way I feel to them is I'm looking down upon them. And I don't mean that I work at it. It's not that I think, no, not at all. It's just, you did that? Bye, sorry. But apparently I'm peculiar. We're out of time? Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.